All right. Good evening, everyone. Glad that you are here. We are Alpha Sigma Lambda. We are in South Dallas, Alpha Phi Fraternity Incorporated, and we are here today to have our Alpha Talk with who is no stranger to the chapter, Mr. Jim Schutze. With us today, we also have Brother Jim Jackson and Brother Rod Tyler, uh, who were not with us the first time, but are with us this time to bring in a local perspective, um, if you will, a deeper dive perspective in some of the discussions that we're going to talk about today with the republishing of the accommodation. So if you don't have yours, if you would look at the screen, the bottom of the screen to crawl, you have a way that you can purchase it. I'm just so fortunate when I actually have both the original and the new. And we'll talk a little bit about the information inside. So before we begin, I just want to introduce our guest for tonight. Mr. Jim Schultz is an acclaimed journalist and author, a longtime political journalist at the Dallas Times Herald and the Dallas Observer, and former Dallas Bureau chief of the Houston Chronicle. Schultz currently is a columnist, at the magazine. He has earned many honors for his writing, receiving the Association of Alternative News Weekly's National Award for Best Commentary twice, and the Lincoln University's National Unity Award for writing on civil rights and racial issues 3 times. Two of his books were finalists for the National Edgar Allan Poe Award for criminal writing. In 2011, Schultz was admitted to the Texas Institute of Letters in recognition for his career as a journalist and author. And would be remiss without if I did not include an additional individual that many of us know, who has a forward in the book, which we will talk a little bit about, and that is John Wiley Price, who wrote the forward for the book. Is a ranking member of the Dallas County Commissioners Court, the first African American elected to the court. Price has served as Dallas County's commissioner for District 3 since 1985. In addition to his political service, Price founded Kwanzaa Fest, the largest community cultural event in Texas, in 1991. So, Mr. Schultz, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Mr. Jackson, welcome.
Good evening.
Brother Tyler, welcome.
Good evening.
Good evening. So, Mr. Schultz, I want to just first, before we begin, thank you for coming back again and spending this time with us. We had such a great time in our previous discussion with you. It was just like old fellas just sitting around shooting the breeze, discussing something that was very light, race relations in Dallas. So we had a great time and thought that we should do it again. And we're excited about the opportunity to do this with the new release of your book. So we just had to have you back. And I believe that today was supposed the original date of release, if I'm correct.
Yes, yeah. So it's
Okay.
great to be here, and we did have a great discussion the other time. It's good to be back.
Okay, so with that, the way that this will go, we'll just start off with some simple questions, and we'll start off with softball questions. You know, softball question like, why was the book banned? Why was the book pulled from the shelves?
You know, it was going to be published locally in 1986 by Taylor Publishing. This was the old printing technology where they had to make lead plates for each page, and that was very expensive. So they had gone to the expense of making all of the page plates, and they were to roll it on the press one day, and pressure from a gentleman who's no longer with us named Alex Bickley, who was the executive director of the Dallas Citizens Council, persuaded Taylor to pull it off the press that day. And so they did. The New York Times did a story about it being suppressed, and they quoted the Reverend Peter Johnson as saying it was suppressed because the white establishment in Dallas didn't want the story of Dallas's past told. So the New York Times ran that story. There was a guy in New Jersey who was kind of a renegade publisher, and he said he saw the story and he said, well, I'll publish it. So he did. He called up Taylor Publishing in Dallas and said, how much would it cost me to get all those page plates? And they said, not a dime. We'll put them on a truck and send them to you right now if you will get this thing out of our house. And so they sent it to him for free. He published the book and he shipped it back to Dallas. I learned later that a colleague of mine at the Times Herald had been going to Bickley and telling him about the book. I don't understand how the guy knew what the book was going to say, but he told Bickley that I was a dangerous, bad guy who came from Detroit, and I was going to write a book that would make Dallas look bad. And so that's why it got pulled from Taylor Publishing.
Okay. Good. Okay, well, as we get started, I kind of want to go back in time, much like your writing. You do a great job of telling the story full circle, giving the background information on it, so much so that I like your new nickname. You're Rash.
Yeah, sounds like eczema or something, but yeah.
Well, that is a name that Commissioner John Wiley Price gave you in the forward. It talks about describing you, and I want to say I think it was very well written. I think it describes you to the T in terms of your style of writing. And for those that don't know, it's not like eczema, but his term for rash was actually an acronym, which I thought was very apropos for you.
Yes, I was surprised by how generous Commissioner Price's forward was. He and I were very close when we were young men. We talked all the time. We had a falling out over a local issue. I guess we'd gotten old and crabby, and we stopped talking to each other. But he overcame all of that. When we finally met around this book, I told him that he was the bigger man. He was the one who overcame it and said that the book was more important than our difficulties. And so he wrote this very generous foreword for the book, which the book kind of needed in this day and age.
That I agree. And his discussion or his description of you leads me to ask a question. Who was Jim Schutze when he was 35, 37?
Well, it's funny. I'd forgotten who he was. I reread the book recently, and I was struck by something that I really had forgotten, which was a lot of angry voice in it. That I could tell that the Jim Schutze who wrote this book was angry, and I didn't really remember that. And I tried to think back to why. I mean, what did I have to be angry about? I was a white guy working downtown. I wasn't from Dallas. It wasn't my deal. And I remembered that there was a thing about the city then that did really get on my nerves. And it was this line that white people in Dallas talked, white people in powerful positions, was very smug and self-satisfied. And it was a story that Dallas never had any racial problems at all of any kind. I was from Detroit, So the first thing I would get from white people was, "Oh, you must think you've died and come to heaven. Get out of that terrible city." I actually loved Detroit. Detroit was cool in a lot of ways. And so that got under my skin. And then this story that, well, we never had any of that trouble here. And then there was this phrase, our black people, and they didn't always use the term black people. I mean, the degree to which spoken racism was just casual among white people was very shocking. Not just to me. I talked to lots of people who came here from other places, other parts of Texas. Eddie Bernice Johnson told me that when she came to Dallas from Waco, she was shocked by the way some white people talked here. It's pretty bad when Waco's looking down on you. And
True.
so anyway, that all just made me angry. And I guess I thought, and I'm thinking in terms of the white people here, I thought, you think you're better than white people in the rest of the country, and you're not. You're just behind. And this is just work you haven't done. You don't get out of this. The clock doesn't go backwards. And I also didn't believe the story that there had never been uprising or rebellion or pushback here. And so I wanted to find out if that was true. And that spurred a lot of my research.
Yeah, and I'm not quite sure how you see it or think about it, but what do you think about the bombings?
That was that's a story that nobody white in the city, first of all, ever admitted to. And obviously the white people who were in power when it happened knew all of it. I interviewed Henry Wade, who was still alive and was still the district attorney, and he was the DA during the bombings, so he remembered it. But it was a story that was just denied. And it was a very important story for what it showed about the white community, which is brutal. I mean, this I'm not making this up. The grand jury investigation found that a coalition of white church groups in South Dallas was then majority white, a coalition of church groups hired thugs to do the bombings. So that was important. But the other thing that was important was that black people were out on their lawns with shotguns defending. So the story that black people were just passive here was nonsense. They weren't passive at all. In fact, it was that resistance that pushed black leadership to go to the Citizens Council, white leadership, and say, because the white folks who were behind the bombings were middle to working class. They were not the rich, elite white people. So the black clergy went to the rich, elite white people and said, you better put a stop to this or your city's going to light up. And the rich, elite white people looked at it and said, that looks like it's possibly true. And so they're the ones who, through this grand jury process, put a stop to the bombings. But the bombings were evidence that, there were bombings in other cities in the South. It was handled differently here. But the reaction to the bombings, and I'm talking about the people out in front of their houses with shotguns, showed that black people here weren't, accepting this? Does somebody think black people accepted the bombings? That story is sort of obscene. And it's untrue. And it was that kind of stuff that just made me angry and made me think, you folks are stupid. If you think that kind of thing is true, and you better get over it. Because I came from Detroit, I guess I thought, there's a good way to get through this, and there's a very bad way. And I just lived through the bad way. And if you don't get up to speed, you're going to live through the same thing. So that was a lot of my feeling in working on the book.
That is a lot to unpack in just that statement, because that could lead in so many directions. that we can add to. If Brother Tyler Jackson, you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, you mentioned that the black clergy here in Dallas went to the White Citizens Council and said, you know, y'all need to stop that. And I believe one of those people was Dr. E.C. Estelle. So can you contrast his boldness with taking that particular step and pretty much threatening them with violence to his unwillingness to accept Martin Luther King and a King visit to the city?
Well, the person who I talked to more about this, and I actually talked to him after the book came out, was the pastor of St. Luke Community, longtime the emeritus pastor. Help me, I'm having a senior moment here. I'm talking about Zan Holmes.
Zan Holmes.
And Reverend Holmes and I talked a lot at a certain period in time, and he explained to me that there was a denominational split in the black church before MLK Jr. that actually involved MLK Sr., more his father. And there was a wing of the church that was so-called then assimilationist, which we would call, I guess, integrationist. And there was a wing of the church that was more separatist, that said, we're not really interested in being around a bunch of white people. And we see our destiny as separate. And Dallas was a national headquarters, sort of the separatist way of looking at things, as Reverend Holmes explained this to me. And so they crossed swords with MLK Sr., and there may have been some bad blood from that. So when MLK Jr. came, that was still the feeling that there was a feeling among Dallas clergy, and Reverend Estelle was certainly one, that we don't need to hear this stuff from what was always referred to as the leadership from the South, which didn't mean Dallas. When people here said the South, they meant old Dixie. They meant Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, maybe South Carolina, certainly. But there was a hostility in the church toward that leadership that was associated with the King family. And some of that bled over. The guy who told me specifically about MLK Jr.'s visits was Peter Johnson, who was with MLK Jr. when they came to town. And he told me of a time when MLK Jr. came to town and was just generally snubbed so badly by black clergy in Dallas that when they got out back to Love Field and they were getting on the plane to go back to Atlanta, Peter said that.
Well, we temporarily lost our host, but our guest, they'll be back with us shortly. But that is a good question that you asked in terms of the clergy. And there we go.
Am I back?
We got you back.
Okay. Peter Johnson told me that when MLK Jr. was leaving town and they were getting on the plane at Love Field, he said, I don't really have time for this. I don't know that we should invest resources in Dallas, because in Dallas, nobody wants us there. And there are other cities where they do. And so MLK Jr. made a decision, I'm done with Dallas. Certainly that was spurred by the fact that Dallas was done with him, but it was kind of, as Peter's description, it was kind of mutual. Like, okay, you don't want me here, I'm not coming back. And it did go back to this split in the church that was earlier.
I have a question on that same line. Were those the same forces that forced Maynard Jackson and his family out of the city?
You know, that's a story that I don't know well. I know that Maynard Jackson's father was a well-known minister here, right?
Correct.
And had a big church, and I've had people tell me, yeah, he decided kind of the same thing. He was active in the movement around the country, not just in Dallas, but Maynard Jackson Jr.'s father was active in North Carolina and other places I know, and that was not well received here. And so the story I got was that he decided to pull up stakes and take the family to Atlanta, and certainly that family was one of those families that made Atlanta a kind of an African American mecca. Uh, but it's not a story that I can claim to know. And, you know, I never interviewed anybody in that family. I don't know it firsthand.
Okay. Also, interwoven in all of our discussions is the name of the Dallas Citizens Council. Can you comment on their impact on the city of Dallas and its politics over the years?
Well, back at the time I was writing about in the book, they negotiated the end of the bombings. Black leadership said to them, the end of the bombings isn't enough. We need a place where Black people of means, professional people, business people, can live safely in houses that are commensurate with our economic standing. And so that's where Hamilton Park came from. And the Citizens Council definitely helped to come up with that deal. I did learn in researching that deal that the Citizens Council's first idea was to build the new Black neighborhood in the floodplain. And the leadership said, no, we don't really want houses in the floodplain. And so they came up with Hamilton Park, which was out in the country at the time. At the time I wrote the book, I think things were still so backward with them. My editor came to me and said, you have been summoned to appear before the Citizens Council. And I said, well, do they have a subpoena or something? And he said, just don't give me any grief. Just go meet them. So I went to this place downtown that I remember as being like a little courtroom. And these guys were all at a dais, and I was out in front. And they said to me, Mr. Schutze, what do the Black people want? And I said, you know, these are confusing times, and you can't judge everybody by their appearance. But I said, you guys know I'm white, don't you? And they went, yes, we know. You know, we know that. And I said, well, I'm not going to answer that question, and you need to invite an African American person here to ask that question, and I can suggest some if you don't know anybody. And they were very grateful that I gave them some names, and I left thinking, these guys, this is the 1980s, and these guys are out of the 1940s. Now, I've had conversations with the Citizens Council leadership now about this new republishing of the book. The CEO of the Citizens Council was an African American man who came here from Atlanta, Kelvin Walker, who's a really interesting, thoughtful person. The recent ex-chairman of their board, Fred Perpall, is Black, CEO of a Fortune 500 company. I think the Citizens Council still has great influence. Sometimes I wish they didn't, but it's not like what it was. And also the Citizens Council isn't like what it was. Times have changed, and I'd be a fool not to recognize that they have changed. And it looks to me like they've changed for the better.
Well, Glad you said that because there are still some, as you know, some baked in racism in terms of tentacles throughout the city, whether it's transportation, education, housing, and many of those are talked about in the book in terms of their influence. Can you talk a little bit about John Stemmons, uh, the Trinity River Industry Project? I know at one point they weren't for um, in floodplains, having floodplains, but then they also switched that when they saw promise for land
Yeah,
acquisition.
and they drew in hundreds of millions of dollars in federal money to beef up those levees and build the pump stations and do everything to protect the land once it was their land for industrial redevelopment. Another of the stories that drives me crazy that I used to hear back when I first came here is, well, we don't believe in federal dollars. We never take a penny from the federal government. And the whole Trinity River Industrial District was built with federal dollars to both to dry it out, but also eminent domain to run off the people on the land that they wanted to redevelop. Um, that you talk about the tentacles still being out there. It took me, since I wrote the book, then I was covering City Hall for another 30 years or so. And it took me a long time to realize that where the old leadership gets really serious is when you get into these very high dollar contracting public works things like highways, schools, infrastructure. They're real serious.
And he will return again. Apologize for that. But that leads us, like I said, their influence is still, and we have him back.
Okay, am I back?
You're back.
I don't think this program likes my looks. But
Maybe it's the
anyway,
glasses.
uh, uh, certainly, Councilman Wilson, you would know that when you get into the basic guts of contracting and so on, then the old power structure shows up, right? If you're talking about the convention center or anything that's really high dollar, and I guess the reasons are obvious. That's where the
money is.
money is. Like the guy who said he robbed banks, because that's where the money is.
And that's where I was going because there's also an influence in the educational component, which I thought was very interesting, and how the sentiment in Dallas was that integration was gentle or easy integration in the city of Dallas. I think that's one-sided.
Sure, especially if you look at outcomes, there's this great, interesting story in the morning news this week. Something that they just, I think, declined to do for years, but they've gone back and looked at the ACE school program under Hinojosa and Mike Miles beforehand, where they poured resources into really high need schools. And Hinojosa says in the story that before they kind of were guilty of malpractice because they would send the most inexperienced baby teachers to the schools where the kids' needs were the greatest. And the teachers just worked for 8 months and quit, never come back. So they've turned that around and they've had great results with a lot of schools, Dunbar and others, and Humphrey Lee, and where they've shown that in fact, I wish I could name the school. But there's one of these schools that the state was threatening to close. And after the ACE program was in there for a couple of years, those kids were scoring above the elementary kids in Highland Park. And what it
Always seems to happen almost at the apex of the story. So we'll just give it just a few seconds, but until he gets back on, where I was going with that is that in the book it talks about how the schools were influential or were a part of the systematic racism in Dallas. And in terms of whether it was during segregation times, inadequate resources, and just talking about, again, those tentacles in different areas that we talk about and that we experience every day that are still, I think DISD is, if I'm correct, is just finishing their equity study, a racial equity study, in terms of looking at um, um, ordinances or laws that they created that are detrimental to individuals who are minorities in the district, as it shifts, as it changes to a predominantly minority district.
Yes. And if you, in a way, these things all come back to the heart and to empathy and compassion. If a bunch of rich white people in Highland Park looked at a school and they saw the children coming out of that school unable to read, and they saw the children on what they're calling this kindergarten to prison pipeline, where they wind up in the life of, they get in trouble early in incarceration. Obviously, those Highland Park parents would say, well, that's terrible. Those are our children. We need to pump resources. We need to do whatever we can do to rescue those children. But all of that empathy and commitment and heart is withdrawn and withheld because of racism. And so the kids in the schools and the neighborhoods are cut off from just the amount of civic commitment that they deserve as Americans, as members of the city. And so I think what the school district is doing now is they're proving that if you put that stuff back in, and it's not just money, it has to be heart, it has to be commitment, it has to be caring what happens to those kids. The kids.
The kids will learn. The kids will improve the quality of education. As an educator, that the more resources that are supplied to individuals, the better their education will be. And that's not necessarily from science labs, but also from the teachers, the committed teachers, committed administrators, executive directors, and even a committed superintendent.
Yes.
DISD has had some, I would say, racially right-leaning superintendents in the past. Before Linus Wright, there were a couple, W.T. White and another, I can't recall his name. Can you comment on the tenure, especially that change between Linus Wright and W.T. White?
And Linus Wright was new when I was new here. I thought he was a kind of extraordinary guy, especially because when I was reading about W.T. White, I thought, okay, this guy's a straight up racist, and he's going to design a school system that is for white kids and that is designed to create failure in black schools. And I think that's exactly what he did. And Linus Wright saw that, and I think he made an honest attempt at turning it around, but Linus Wright wasn't enough. You still had the whole white leadership of the city that was thinking like W.T. White. So we had to wait some years for things to turn around. They haven't turned around yet. Let me just say, there's a story I've always gotten from my white liberal friends, which is, oh, it's terrible, the effects of poverty on kids. You know, when they live in poverty, they can't learn. And the only cure is to end poverty. Oh, we tried to do that under LBJ and it didn't work. So I guess there's nothing we can do. So we'll just go on the way it is. And that's all a terrible excuse for not doing anything. And I think the great thing about what DISD is doing now is saying it's not up to us to decide what social class or economic situation these kids come from. It's up to us to take the kids as they are and teach them to read and do math successfully by the end of third grade. And they're doing it. I mean, it's wonderful that they're doing it, and they're not using poverty. What they're proving is that kids can come from poverty, terrible poverty, in tough circumstances, and still learn as much as these kids in the Park Cities. If you get in there and do it, if you get it done.
You know, this past weekend I had a chance to go to the PV Grambling game, and after the game, I was going to go get a corn dog, and I was standing right by Big Tex,
Yeah.
and it made me think about back in the day, that the one day that the State Fair of Texas had for African Americans, and the powers that be, and we'll talk about the Ku Klux Klan influence that had on the city, and how they permeated every aspect of the city and their influence. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think the fair is almost like the religious real heart of the city in a lot of ways. And the fair board was certainly where it was kind of like a fraternity for the old leadership. And the fair was the most resistant to integration in the most insulting ways for a long time, and was the most stubborn opponent of change. And there's another example of where the Black community in the city never accepted. The fair would offer these sort of compromises, like they said they would have Negro Achievement Day, and Black people could come on one day, and the Black leadership in the city, when Diane Ragsdale was a little kid, she was out there with other groups picketing, saying, no, it's not going to be one day, it's going to be every day. So then the fair opens itself up every day, but they have certain rides where there might be physical contact. And so they said, well, we can't integrate those, because Black people and white people might bump into each other, touch each other. And so that's just an example of the smallness, the pettiness of that kind of bigotry. And the Black community didn't accept that either, and said, no, open is open, integrated is integrated. But it had to be fought inch by inch. And the fair dragged its heels all the way. My son has worked at the fair for 10 years, and he was there when Big Tex burned. And if you'll remember, after Big Tex burned, they had to get a new Big Tex.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was aware that there was all this, I guess some of this went public, anxiety about, well, what if the new Big Tex isn't as white as the old one?
Mm-hmm.
What color are we going to paint Big Tex? And there was starting to be rumbles. And I'm not sure exactly how he came out. He still looks like a white guy to me, but I thought, how remarkable. In a city that is now overwhelmingly majority of color, Big Tex shouldn't look like me. he should represent the city. He should represent Texas, and he still doesn't. Uh, so I'm not sure that battle is behind us.
Can we go back to the contracting piece, the big money piece? You talked about the members of the Dallas Citizen Council continuing to maintain control over large city, I guess, and county construction projects where large amounts of dollars are generated. You know, I attended a banquet a few years back, and the master of ceremony was the late Governor Bill Clements, and the honorees were Trammell Crow and H.C. Beck. And it turns out they all played high school football on the same Texas State Championship football team. Those individuals plus others, they still play a prominent role in the city of Dallas and all of the construction activities in the area.
Yeah, I some of that is over my head. Some of it I just don't. I never got to. Where I saw it most clearly was in the Trinity Toll Road project, and I know when Laura Miller was mayor, she was a former colleague of mine, and I was writing a lot of stuff that was critical of the toll road project, and she called me up and said, "Schutze, you got to get off this. That thing's going to be built." And I said, "Well, not if people oppose it, not if there's enough opposition. There are a lot of things wrong with it." And she said, "You don't get it. It doesn't matter who opposes it. The boys, the guys, the Citizens Council guys, they want it done, and it's going to be done." And I thought, damn, because I like Laura. I respected Laura. I think she was getting a lot of this from her husband. And I thought, Laura's probably a lot closer to these people than I'll ever be. And she didn't mean that it should be done or it had to be done. She meant that the people behind it still felt that if they said something was going to be built, it was going to be built. And they would be the ones who would name who's in on it, who gets the job, who gets the work. These things are all supposed to be publicly bid, but you know how that works. You design the specs so that it's going to favor this company or that company, and it all stays within a small number of hands. And I don't know how we compare in Dallas to other cities in that regard, but I suspect not very well. I think that that's still a very closely held game, and I think it's the real reason why the old establishment still wants to hang on, why they're so determined to hang on. I think the city has been their piggy bank for a long time, and they don't want to give it up.
Okay, Mr. Schultz, I got a question for you. Can you speak on the history of the African American influence or African Americans in Deep Ellum and how they were systematically relocated?
You're talking about Deep Ellum?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, one of the great cultural centers of our nation in terms of music and culture, and also small business. And there have been waves of redevelopment over the years. I know there was a lot of those landowners hoped at one point that would all become high rise. I think what you see too, this continuing conflict that I think we're back in now, where everybody's idea is, okay, we're going to capitalize on the past of Deep Ellum, and we're going to make it a really cool entertainment district like New Orleans. Okay, if you go to the quarter in New Orleans, that's a very diverse scene. That's part of what's cool about it, and it's part of how it expresses its history. So we get Deep Ellum cranking, and the minute it becomes too diverse, all of a sudden, we have these crackdowns and efforts to control the crowd, and that's a formula for more trouble. The curse of deep ellum is that it's just not truly cool. It's not cool. It's only cool with certain kinds of entertainment and crowds, which tend to be whiter, more affluent, more SMU, and so I'm afraid I hope I'm wrong, but I'm afraid I see some. I mean, I wonder what you think. I'm afraid I see some of that same tension coming back.
I would have to agree with you. I don't know if you remember this, but when Deep Ellum was going through its transformation, this was maybe back in the '90s, late '90s, mid to late '90s, maybe late '90s, early 2000s, and it was going through its transformations. And this was when tattoo parlors were becoming prevalent. And during that time period, I was on the Plan Commission. I remember the Deep Ellum Association coming to the city and wanting certain ordinances to prevent X amount of tattoo parlors to be so many feet from each other, and to limit these types of businesses that would bring diversity to the area. And I remember I asked the board member that were speaking that day, "Are you sure that you want this? Because if you get what you ask for, you're going to kill Deep Ellum." And so he was adamant about it, and that he wanted it. And I was like, okay, tell you what, I'm gonna give you what you asked for. And they got it, and it killed Deep Ellum.
And is the problem? It's not necessarily racism; it's square. What I've heard from people who are buskers, street entertainers, that's a big deal in New Orleans. That's a big part of the fun. And when they've tried to do it in Deep Ellum, that's something my son did for a living for a number of years in Charleston, South Carolina. And the business owners in Charleston would pay him, I guess they weren't bribes, we call them stipends, to please come do your act in front of my place, because he drew a big crowd. And there's a lot of activity, and people can make money. You know, people came in the bar or the restaurant. It was a good thing. So in Deep Ellum, the property owners have done everything they can to run off the street entertainers because they think there's something.
I apologize again for our connection. Really good discussion and historical aspect of Deep Ellum. Is there anything else, anything, Brother Tyler Jackson, that you want to add to that in
Okay.
terms of Deep Ellum? Go ahead.
So I guess I dropped out for a bit, but I think it's this weird, Dallas at a certain point was called the buckle on the Bible Belt. And not all of that kind of squareness has gone away.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're absolutely right. If you're Deep Ellum, why don't you want tattoo parlors? What are you trying to be? Highland Park? That won't work.
Yes, Mr. Schutze. Also, it said that when the freeway was constructed, it was the death knell for Deep Ellum. And there was no regard for the African American community that was present at that time. Can you expound on that?
Well, certainly the construction of the freeways and Central Expressway and its extension, the extension through southern Dallas of what are we talking about there? We're talking about, anyway, the extension of the freeway that cuts across southern Dallas.
35?
Yeah, all those things. There's some really interesting research that's been done just in recent years. The story I always heard was, "Oh, what a shame! We put those freeways through the black communities, and we didn't realize it was going to kill commerce and kill the community." There's research being done now where they're actually getting back into the documents and the planning and so on, and they explicitly designed these things for that purpose. I mean, I think that's a big change in our knowledge of history that's more recent. It's certainly way after I wrote my book, where people have looked at redlining, and there's a story about redlining that, oh, we're just trying to find people who have good credit and so on. And you get back into the actual documents and the meetings and what they were talking about in the 30s and 40s. And no, they weren't imposing rules of good credit at all. They were imposing rules of racism, trying to run off black communities. They denied credit to black people who had excellent credit. Who else was going to put money down on a mortgage anyway? They had to have money. And generally speaking, I've seen studies that have said that in the 30s and 40s, if you were black and you had money, you had tight credit because you knew that white establishment was coming after you all the time, hoping for you to miss a payment, to screw up, so they could snatch the property back. So you had this population of black business people, professionals, and so on, who had probably way better credit than the white folks, and yet redlining denied them credit. So it wasn't about credit, and the freeways weren't just accidentally run through the communities. I think it's coming out now more explicitly that this stuff is all very intentional and not at all an accident or a coincidence. Which is, whenever I say that to black people, if we're just talking, I always get this look like, yeah? Are you just figuring that out? But it is news to a lot of white people. A lot of white people are just now waking up to that story.
Yes, waking up to that story. And you were talking about transportation and going through neighborhoods, and in terms of that just being pure racism. Are there not some of our major thoroughfares named after Ku Klux Klan members?
Yeah. R.L. Thornton was a big deal in the Klan, and those names are still around, and I keep waiting. In the big renaming thing, they're going after the schools. So far, it's been limited to if you were a Civil War general or something. But I would think the Klan would be, in my view, that's every bit as bad as being a Civil War general, isn't it? I mean, maybe a little worse. So when do those names come up? I keep listening.
Well, just keep your pen and pad ready. We may have another story here. So,
Well, on that note, if we do get around to eliminating Klansmen from freeways, maybe we can get some of those names off of DISD schools at the same time.
yeah, and that's part of what it was saying in terms of the elimination of generals, Confederate generals. But we also have a plethora of major highways that go through black neighborhoods and brown neighborhoods that are named after Klansmen. And like I said, Dallas was a hub for the Klan.
And this stuff isn't just history or ceremonial. When they pulled Robert E. Lee out of the park on Turtle Creek, the day they pulled that statue out, I looked up and there was a young woman coming across the street whom I recognized. She was a kid who grew up on my block, and she's African American, and I hadn't seen her in a long time. We hugged. And then she was watching the statue come out, and I saw that she had tears in her eyes. And she said, Mr. Schutze, I never thought I'd see this day in Dallas. And it was very moving that it meant a lot to her. That the city was just willing and ready to do that, get that thing out of there. And man, that every time I hear somebody say, oh, they're rewriting history, we need to know our past. And I think, not as much as we need that young woman to believe in the to look at that statue coming out and say, okay, this city cares about it. That's worth a whole lot more to me than statues.
Well, with that, as we say, time flies when you're having fun, and it means a lot to us that you decided that to meet with us again and have a, if you will, just a good old discussion about Dallas and how it began and where we see it going forward. So, with that, as we are preparing to wrap up, we just want to encourage everybody to remember that there is an election coming up on November the 2nd. There are 8 constitutional amendments. We want you to be informed. So you can follow us on our social media platforms where we will and go to ballotpedia.org, which has a great synopsis of all 8 amendments. It lets you know whether if you vote yes or vote no for those amendments, what that means. I want to encourage you to go out and be an educated voter. Typically, constitutional amendments are the lowest voter turnout, but we want to increase that this time. We want voters voting every time the polls are open. So again, as we're closing, I want to leave this. I want to thank our panelists, Brother Taylor, Brother Jackson, Ms. Schutze, for your time, and I want to give each individual an opportunity to say what they would like as we prepare to leave for today. So start with Brother Taylor, and we'll finish with you, Ms. Schutze.
You just called me Brother Taylor?
Tyler. No, I said Tyler. You heard Tyler.
No, I don't have anything to add. Next time we do this, Mr. Schutze, I'll tell you an interesting story about one of those people who has a freeway named after them and how he ran into my grandmother one day. But that's a story for another time.
I'd like to hear it.
And also, maybe the next time we get together, we can talk about why there is such pushback when we talk about renaming the school Woodrow Wilson, which is named after one of the most renowned Klansmen in the city of Dallas. But the graduates, they don't want to remove the name.
Okay. Emmett Schultz will leave you with the final words.
Well, I really enjoyed it, as I did last time. This is a great group and a great discussion. And as I said before we started out, I think something has changed. And
Appears we lost him again.
okay. Anyway, I've really enjoyed this, and I'm honored to be here. And thank you very much for inviting me.
You're muted, Eric. Eric, you're muted.
Maybe we'll thank you for that. We thank you for being with us, and maybe it's the glasses that's causing that, or the fact that you're a rash. One of the two.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna look myself over tonight and check that rash thing.
Well, it's been a great pleasure and great opportunity and a great time that we had. And like I said, maybe those stories about the running into your grandmother and the school naming, maybe we can all sit down and maybe have some strong tea to talk about it.
Thank you very much. See ya. Good night.
Thank you.
Good
Have a
night.
great
Good
evening.
night.